Good evening. I'm Sarah Herda. I'm the director of the Graham Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all here for the opening of our new exhibition, The Flesh is Yours, the Bones Are Ours, by Michael Rakowitz. This exhibition is meaningful on many registers. Institutionally, it brings together the two main programs of the Graham Foundation, grant-making and public programs, what we do in the world and what we do in Chicago, what we do here in this house. This project first came to us as a proposal that led to a grant to Michael to assist in the production of the project for the 14th Istanbul Biennial, drafted by Carolyn Christoph Bakarjiev, where it premiered last fall. Personally, the second register, after knowing Michael for many years, first meeting on the gallery floor of the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, and staying in orbit with him as we both relocated to Chicago now almost 10 years ago. It was actually on another gallery floor that the idea to bring this exhibition to the Graham Foundation was hatched. During the Architecture Biennial, Michael and I ran into each other one morning at the Cultural Center, a building that we both, in different and many ways inhabit often one morning, and one thing led to another, which led to the collaboration with Rhona Hoffman, who's here tonight, and which led to tonight. It reminds me of how important the space of an exhibition is. It's the place to give over to ideas, but it's also a place to meet people, to forge relationships, and to develop yet more ideas. Finally, and the most important register is architecture itself. I often say that not every important idea about architecture comes from an architect, and that could not be more true than tonight. While by no means exclusively concerned with architecture, in this and other works, Michael unearths the social and political narratives embedded in the designed environment. Originally presented on the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, this project tells a narrative of one of the great atrocities of the 20th century, but through the most unsuspecting objects, the delicate traces, the ornamentation that to this day adorns buildings throughout Istanbul, greatly contributing to the very character of the city, and some of which was certainly influenced by Chicago and its architecture of the turn of the century. And in doing so, he revives the memory of the people that made these objects and that are all but forgotten, but here given space again in a protest against forgetting. After the talk, I want to invite you all down to the gallery to see the show and to toast Michael. And I want to thank our board of directors here at the Graham Foundation for their fierce belief in challenging ideas, and the staff here at the Graham that always seems to make everything possible. I'd also like to thank Rhona Hoffman and her gallery, and most of all, I'd like to thank Michael and his wonderful studio. It has been an incredible opportunity to finally work together in this way, and I want to thank you. I'd also like to remind you that this is an exhibition in two parts, and tomorrow at 5, you have to see the other part, which opens at Rhona Hoffman's gallery and will be open concurrently throughout the summer. Michael Rakowitz lives and works in Chicago. His work has appeared in venues worldwide, including Documenta 13, PS1, MoMA, Mass MoCA, Castillo de Rivoli, the 16th Sydney Biennial, the 10th and 14th Istanbul Biennial, Sharjah Biennial 8, the Tirana Biennial, and the National Design Triennial at the Cooper Hewitt, as well as Transmediale 05. Solo exhibitions include the Tate Modern, Lombard Fried Gallery, Truffaut Gallery in Budapest, and Kunstraum in Innsbruck. Rakowitz is a recipient of numerous awards, and his work is featured in major and private collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, New York, Neue Galerie Kassel, the Smart Museum of Art, Chicago, the Van Appel Museum, Eindhoven, the British Museum, and the Kabul National Museum in Afghanistan, as well as UNESCO Paris. Rakowitz is also a professor of art theory and practice at Northwestern University. Join me in welcoming Michael.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. It's a real honor to be working with you also, and to be completely transparent about the different ways we use that gallery floor at the Chicago Cultural Center. It was a wonderful biennial. It's one of my favorite buildings in Chicago, but I used the bathroom there after my psychotherapy sessions across the street, so it was the perfect time to talk about a show. So I want to start with an introduction. In 2008, I spent a great deal of time in Redfern, a largely Aboriginal neighborhood in Sydney, Australia, producing a project that involved Indigenous citizens and organizations from that community for the Biennale. I was struck by the overt racism in the city, the ongoing crimes against and the displacement of Native Australians, now 250 years running. But there was something done as protocol that I felt kept the problems and failures visible and made them present, something I have tried to do in my work for the past decade. More than that, actually. In Australia, the acknowledgement of country is usually a statement or a speech made by an Aboriginal or a non-Aboriginal to show respect to the traditional custodians of the land. I've often believed that the best way to forget someone important is to name a building after them, so their name disappears into an address, into the architecture. I'm sure that similar things have been said about the acknowledgement of country. But as an outsider, I was incredibly moved when I heard this preamble spoken at every public speech. I thought about my own context as an American living on indigenous land taken from its original inhabitants. To live up to my commitment to the citizens of Redfern, I made a promise to myself that I would continue to remind those who had forgotten. Since my return to the US, I have begun all my public lectures with this, an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to the elders, both past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and hopes of Native America. We must always remember that under the concrete and asphalt, this land is, was, and always will be traditional indigenous land. So just to start out very quickly, this is an image of the exhibition, The Flesh is Yours, the Bones Are Ours, as it was installed at the Galata Greek School in Istanbul from September until November 2015. And this is the twinning of the project here at the Graham, similar setting, somewhat different. I want to thank Sarah, Ellen, Ava, Ron, Tom, Claire, Molly, Rachel, and Angel for all their help putting together the exhibition here. This is another part of the exhibition. This is an idea of what you'll see tomorrow at Rhona Hoffman Gallery, and I want to take the time now to say thank you to Rhona, Anastasia, Kara, Kate, and Ben at the gallery. To my team, I especially want to thank Emily, my studio manager, Asla, Sanaz, Leander, Kate, and Robert for all their help. And a special thanks to those who aren't here but are in Istanbul, Kimet Dashtan, Elif Kamishli, Bige Oror, and to Carolyn Christoph Bakarjiev, the draftsperson of the biennial, and somebody who I've had the great pleasure to work with over different times in the last 15 years. Extra special local thanks to John Vinci, Eric Nordstrom, and Tim Samuelson, who made it possible to incorporate some of Louis Sullivan's architectural fragments into this project. So I figured I would start and foreground a couple of different projects that give you an idea of the way that I've worked and my attitude towards material. And so I'll start somewhat at the beginning. This is an ongoing project from 1997 and onward. It's a project called Parasite. It's a series of inflatable shelters that I'd custom build for homeless people in different cities. And the way the shelter works is it attaches to the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning output of a building during the wintertime, and the warm air that's being evacuated by the building simultaneously inflates and heats the double membrane structure. And so the homeless person actually never comes into contact with the warm air that's being blown out of the building. It's a network of tubes, so it's heating through conduction, sort of like putting an air mattress around you. And these are just some of the images of the ones that have been custom built over the years. Everything from one that was custom built for a man named Bill who wanted as much visibility as possible. For him, visibility was somewhere on the way to equality, So he wanted his shelter to be white and to catch the light and to allow for there to be views to all different sides for security issues, but also, like I said, for visibility. To one that was based on the Star Wars character Jabba the Hutt for a science fiction fan named Freddie Flynn. And then one, this was the only couple that I built for, Artie and Myra, who midway through the construction process said that he couldn't just have a sitting room and a loving room. He needed to have 2 sitting rooms because Myra talked too much, so it should look like a bra or a dog bone with a loving room in between. So what has surfaced about this project over the years is that it began as a project that was really about architecture, but because of the storytelling and the transaction of information between me as a citizen of the city and another citizen that's living in it very differently, we found that, of course, our stories are the same in so many ways, that it's an urgent situation, but there's still love, there's still humor. So a project that began about architecture was also about portraiture. And the beautiful exhibition text that the Graham wrote for the project downstairs talks about this kind of fight against forgetting, this fight to create a kind of protest architecture, but also to allow some resistance to the historical forces that guard against the transmission of stories and skill sets. And so one of the ways this project has evolved over the years is that in street magazines, the step-by-step instructions on putting together these shelters, which cost under $5 in terms of material budget, can then be put into the hands of people who need it for the winter. So it's definitely not a project that simply problem solves. It's very much like Krzysztof Wodiczko's description of the bandage. The bandage simultaneously heals, but it also communicates to the rest of the world that something unacceptable has been visited upon the person wearing the bandage. And in an ideal society, people should not have bandages because they should not have wounds. So it's a project that investigates the intersection between problem solving and troublemaking, and that it makes the people that the city wants to keep invisible, visible. Moving into the gallery, I'm going to show you images that greatly affected me in April of 2003. These are images of the Iraq Museum shortly after the looting from April 10th into the 12th, shortly after the American invasion of Baghdad. Dropped artifacts, smashed vitrines, an emptied out museum. And this project led to another one about visibility, but also about using a kind of urgent or impoverished material. I've been using, since 2007, with a team of assistants that now is approaching 30, over the years, I've been reconstructing to scale, or one-to-one scale, the more than 8,000 artifacts that are still listed as missing, stolen, destroyed, or unknown from the Iraq Museum. And I've been using the packaging of Middle Eastern foodstuffs and also the Arabic English newspapers that are distributed for free in cities where there is an Arab presence. So it's about these moments or these fragments of cultural visibility that are being enlisted to make these things that are, for all intents and purposes, no longer visible. And so this is an ongoing work. Like I said, we began in 2007, and to date, I think we've made close to about 500 of the replicas, and this is a project that will clearly outlive me in my studio. When Carolyn and Krzysztof Bakarjiev invited me to be in Documenta in 2008, it preceded her realization that the project should have more positions than just Kassel. And this is an interesting story that Carolyn tells that I love retelling, which is that she was on her BlackBerry and she was typing the word Kassel, capital K-A, and then autocorrect, instead of allowing her to write Kassel, wrote Kabul. So it was like this message from BlackBerry that she should do something in Kabul. But it had so much to do with the fact that when you think about the history of Documenta, in 1955, the first Documenta was curated by Arnold Bode, And it was very much about the reconstruction of Germany and the reconstruction of a city that had been 90% destroyed because of the presence of the Henschel tank factory. And he was wondering what role could culture play in rebuilding Germany. And so if you look at those first images of Documenta, like you look at the orangerie, the ARP sculpture from the orangerie, the orangerie is a ruin. And so Carolyn started to wonder what role could art play in a place that's under siege, and what role does art play in these places that we only perceive through trauma. And so I became very interested in the Buddhas of Bamiyan as a possible site, but not thinking about the rebuilding of the Buddhas. As many of you know, in March of 2001, the Taliban had destroyed these two huge colossal Buddhas that stand over 400 feet tall. They were built in the 6th century. And for me, I had a very special relationship to these sculptures. I was actually trained as a stone carver in high school. And I found out that the dean of my high school was a closet stone sculptor. And he saw drawings of mine in a student exhibition and said that I had the drawings of a sculptor. Would I do an apprenticeship with him? And it changed my life. The three works that he showed me as inspiration, Michelangelo's Prigioni, these unfinished works that are my favorite of his because of the fact that they're unfinished. There's this high contrast between rough stone and polished stone, but also it's this illustration of the idea that he, is always liberating the figure from inside the stone. He also showed me the buildings in Petra, Jordan, carved into the cliff sides there. And then he showed me the Bamiyan Buddhas. And then this is me when I was young and beautiful, age 15. And the first stone carving I'm doing is a tribute to the Bamiyan Buddhas. So when I saw the Buddhas destroyed, it was as if my art history kind of collapsed as well. And so I started to wonder, like, instead of actually doing a remake of the Bamiyan Buddhas, which was very controversial, couldn't we just redistribute the skill sets? It turned out that the Hazara people who live in that part of Afghanistan, who are all Muslim, actually revered the Bamiyan Buddhas. And they have their own narratives that they project onto them. And they've wanted to rebuild them ever since they were collapsed, because the Taliban actually gathered them and said, now we destroy your culture. And of course, like in many instances where the state is destroying culture, they're getting ready to destroy the people as well. So there were massacres. And so UNESCO has said, no, you can't rebuild the Bamiyan Buddhas. And the International Commission of Monuments and Sites has said, no, you can't rebuild the Bamiyan Buddhas. So I wanted to just sort of say, fuck it, let's just give them the skills. Like there hasn't been stone carving in the Bamiyan Valley for over 200 years. And so I started to imagine the transmission of the skill sets almost like the dust that was coming out of the clouds of the Bamiyan Buddhas when they were destroyed. And so for 1 week in May of 2012, I worked with Bert Praxenthaler, who's the head of the UNESCO cultivation and nurturing of the Buddha site, and then also Abbas al-Haddad, who is an Afghani stone carver who has been hunted by the Taliban because of his realistic stoneworks. We worked together to teach 12 students, 6 women, 6 men, in a cave that's right there at the very top near the niche where the head of the Bamiyan Buddhas were. And so this is what the scene looked like. And then I'll just play you a little bit of a video to give you an idea of the sensory effect of hearing these sounds of hammer hitting, chisel hitting stone. Can we make it a little lower while I talk over this? So this man who you see in the blue jacket is actually Abbas al-Haddad, and he showed up to the workshop about 3 days into it. Now, all the students had been really interested in conceptual art. I showed them the same stone carving lecture that I give to my students here in Northwestern. So I started with prehistory, but then we end with like with Maurizio Catalan and his stone carvings of the body bags, and then Wolfgang Leb with this beautiful piece called Milkstone, where he pours milk on top of marble, and you can't tell which is milk, which is marble. And then I also showed them Bryce Canyon, where you have those hoodoos that have been carved by the wind for over, 10,000 years or whatever. And so for 2 days, there was one student who was blowing on his stone, just to see what would happen. It was like conceptual art was alive and well. And when Abbas al-Haddad came in and saw this, he immediately put a stop to it. And he had them all carving realistic forms. And he came to me afterwards and he says, the reason I'm doing this is because there's plenty of abstraction and obfuscation in Afghanistan. It's the real that's radical. And it's him being hunted by the Taliban that clearly is identifying his role as an artist that's pushing the boundaries, that's sort of like informing this. And so it was also nice to be able to kind of completely step back. And one of the things that's happened since this project is that Abbas al-Haddad has opened an atelier there in Bamiyan. And so some of these students go back and they continue to carve. They also exhibited these works in Kabul, in the Documenta in Kabul. So these are the youngest participants in Documenta ever, so ages 16 to like 20. And then the link to Kassel was also strong for me. These are images of the library in Kassel inside the Friedrichsmuseum, which is one of the main venues of Documenta. It's one of the oldest public museums in Europe. It's also one of the most important, well, historically, it was one of the most important libraries in Europe. The Brothers Grimm were actually the first librarians of the library in Kassel. Here you can see it's the library after the Nazis came to power, and of course many of the books that were in the inventory of the library were burned outside of the Friedrichsmuseum and the Friedrichsplatz in Kassel. The British Royal Air Force bombed the Friedrichsmuseum in 1941. About 60 to 70 bombs hit the building. These are the aftermath images. And when I saw these images, I kind of froze because I saw these SS officers who were in these bucket brigades helping kids save the books. And I started to wonder about, that same officer being on the Friedrichsplatz 2 years earlier and now rushing to save what was left. And so these are the aftermath images, which echo for me what we saw in Iraq. The impossible task of trying to put these things back together. Most of these books were made of parchment, so they burned like human skin. That's a statue of the Brothers Grimm. And it's like a ready-made Michelangelo Pistoletto. And then this is the book that they call the Halskraus, which is German for the neck brace. So this is a book of prayers that burned and it opened up like a collar. And when I saw this book at the archives in Kassel, I thought the books have turned to stone. They become petrified. And so immediately I thought about making these works out of stone. So Abbas al-Haddad quarried more of the travertine from the Bamiyan Hills, and working with him, and after he saw that a lot of the books were actually Christian and that he couldn't make crosses and Jesus faces on the cover, it was then exported by the German Air Force to the most Catholic stone carving city in the world, which is Bolzano, Italy. Catholic stone carvers finished it up with me, and then that's the way that the Halskraus looks, carved out of Bamiyan travertine. This is the way the exhibition looked in Kassel. So 34 volumes recreated. And it also tells you something, that the inventory of what was lost is horrible because they don't really know. They're relying on etchings and doing comparisons to before and after. Fragments of the Bamiyan Buddhas were placed alongside the remade books. These were on loan from the Technical University of Munich. They were put in vitrines. The vitrines had some truths that were displayed. This is a quote from Mullah Muhammad Omar, "We are only breaking stones." And then also a quote from him that talked about the fact that he did not want to destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas, but ended up doing it because the people who came to renovate them would not give the money for welfare, but were only interested in the Buddhas, and he thought that it was deplorable that people would keep inanimate objects well-maintained, but not people. And then there was another vitrine which tells the story of heat visited upon different objects and different materials. Inside this vitrine is everything from Libyan desert glass, which is the result of a comet hitting the Libyan desert tens of thousands of years ago. There's also a meteor that fell to the earth on September 11th, but 1954. And then there's the first objects that you see in this vitrine are these cuneiform tablets that were deaccessioned by the British Museum. They're kind of boring receipts from somebody who had a farm to a king. But they're from 2500 BC, from Babylon. And one of the reasons why we have so much cuneiform is many of the storehouses and the libraries in which they were kept ended up burning in fires, so it inadvertently ended up making these terracotta pieces that have survived over time. And then the last thing you see in that vitrine is the Halskraus, where fire visited upon this book does something very different. Moving to Istanbul, these are images that Carolyn shared with me, or this is an image, I should say, that Carolyn shared with me when she did a site visit there. She came upon the atelier of Garabet Cezayirliyan, who was an Armenian artisan in Istanbul, who was responsible for decorating many of the buildings throughout the city. The ornamentation that had come over from Europe after the fire in Pera in 1870 and then the earthquake in 1894 had more or less created a necessity for a lot of rebuilding, and also rebuilding in stone and concrete versus anything that was wooden. So very similar to what's happening here, what happened here in Chicago, which I'll get to. When I saw these images, I knew immediately why she sent them to me, because it was about this idea of craft. But what it turned out was it was also about the transmission of craft. Garabet Cezayirliyan's chief assistant, apprentice, who still runs the atelier, is a man named Kemal Cimbiz, who is Turkish. And it was not common for Turks to be apprenticed to Armenians. And this is where the title of the show comes from, that when you give an apprentice over to a master, there's a quote, a saying that the flesh is yours, the bones are ours. I'm not going to try and pronounce it in Turkish. But it's, to me, as soon as I heard this quote, read about this quote, it seemed appropriate for this kind of a project. So Kemal has continued the work of his Armenian master, and then it revealed the history that many Armenians over time were the architects, the chief architects of many of the sultans, because architecture was seen as a kind of vocation that was beneath people who were purely Turkish. So many of the minorities, not just the Armenians, but the Greeks and also the Kurds, were in these artisanal and artistic professions. The appearance of Art Nouveau, which was the style of the time when the new buildings were built in Istanbul, made me think about one of the reasons that I'm so happy to live in Chicago, which is the kind of all-star team of architects that one sees throughout the city. And of course, Louis Sullivan. I grew up in New York, and so we only have one Sullivan building, but there are many here. So there's a plaster acoustic tile from the demolished Garrick Theater, which was designed by Louis Sullivan, that's on loan from Tim Samuelson, that you can see as part of the project, but I'll get back to the Garrick Theater in a bit. More images of the atelier. And what Kemal explained to me was that not only is this a kind of threatened transmission of Armenians to Turks, but it's also a threatened profession, because many of the craft ornamentation that's being done in Istanbul now is being done in styrofoam. And the argument for why it should be done in styrofoam is because it's on a fault line, so there's a lot of earthquakes, and so when it falls on you, you know, it's styrofoam and not plaster. When I went to the atelier, I presented this book, the Edwards manufacturing company, the Edwards Metal Sealing Company. This was a book that Kemal explained to me that he and his master had riffed on ever since he had started working in the atelier. So the decorative motifs of Louis Sullivan's Art Nouveau-inspired tile designs were produced and oftentimes like bootleg by places like the Edwards Metal Sealing Company in Cincinnati. And at his atelier in Topane, it was revealed that many of Cezayirliyan's creations were heavily inspired by this catalog. And then in the vitrine at Rhona's, what you can see is an Edwards metal ceiling tile from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is a military prison that was built with prison labor, and also a ceiling tile from the Cherokee National Headquarters in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And so then you see the catalog image, and then you see the way that they just reproduced it, kind of like cut and paste. One of the things that Tim Samuelson mentioned to me recently was that W.F. Norman acquired the patterns of other pressed metal fabricators when they went out of business. It can't be said for sure if they're responsible for adapting one of Sullivan's designs for the Guarantee Building Buffalo into stock metal, but it's definitely in their current catalog. They also have offered different Sullivan-esque panels which didn't derive from an actual piece of a Sullivan ornament, but in Tim's words, they're actually very nicely done. And then this is me with Tim in his office in August of 2015, when he very generously lent me some of the Sullivan fragments from the Garrick Theater. And then when I went to Istanbul 2 days later, I came across the Rhona building in Istanbul bearing this design, which was built in 1906. So in the vitrines, you'll also see newspapers. This is a newspaper that talks about the Great Fire in Pera, which prompted the decision that all new buildings would be made of stone as opposed to traditional wood. This event, along with the devastating Istanbul earthquake of 1894, brought the European style of Art Nouveau to the city. Architects from Europe recruited Armenian craftspeople to model and cast and plaster or carton-pierre, the decorative ornaments on the city's new buildings. And so for me, when I think about this, I think about the fact that these traces of Armenian fingers and hands are still there, and they've borne witness to what's happened before 1915 and then after 1915. One thing that should be said is that the problems did not start, in 1915. There's plenty of ethnic strife in Istanbul before then. The Great Chicago Fire in 1871 decimated the city and gave rise to new buildings built in stone and steel instead of wood. Architect Louis Sullivan moved to Chicago in 1873 and helped rebuild the city, populating his designs with Art Nouveau and Celtic Revival ornamentation. And so one of the things you can see when you look closely at these newspapers is that, it's the language of the time, but the headlines are about the great calamity in Istanbul, or Constantinople, I should say, and then the great calamity in Chicago. So maybe we could bring back the term calamity. And then the object that's in this vitrine is a piece of wire lathe from underneath the plaster walls of an entire building that melted in the Great Fire of Chicago, also on loan from the great Tim Samuelson. These are, so as I was planning this project, I was doing a lot of buying on eBay. So eBay is a big part of my practice. I don't get any sponsorship, but it began with the knowledge that a lot of those Iraqi artifacts first found their way onto marketplaces like eBay, and then, of course, Sotheby's and other auction houses. And so I've been sort of, what should we say, stalking eBay since 2007. And so these are Ottoman bullet molds that were made by the Ottoman gunpowder factory, and I'll explain who was in charge of that in a little bit. And then this is a Larnach pipe wrench that I bought from actually an auto body shop in Karakoy, Istanbul. And it happened to be patented in April of 1915 when the genocide began. So it's about these objects that then become implicated as these like time portals, as having something to do with their birth during a time when people were disappearing. Then there are pictures of what happened to the population of dogs in Istanbul during its period of time of modernization. And a lot of people will say, well, not a lot of people, but there's some people who will say that the first genocide of the 20th century was not humans, it was dogs. 80,000 dogs were rounded up by the authorities in Istanbul in 1910, and they were exiled to the barren island of Sivriada in the Sea of Marmara. And some of them even drowned trying to return to the city. And it was said you could hear their howls on the main part of Istanbul at night. Next to that is a picture of Armenian porters who are throwing themselves into the Bosphorus in a failed attempt to save themselves from Turkish soldiers. And this etching is actually from 1896. Other things that are in the vitrines, I talk about Cass Gilbert's Woolworth building, which was called the Cathedral of Commerce. And as a skyscraper, having some dialogue with what was going on with Sullivan here. A detail of that building shows a disembodied Native American head when it was built in 1913. And then that's put next to a picture of Armenians decapitated by Turkish troops. This is from the same neighborhood. It's actually right near the building, near the French orphanage where Garabet Cezayirliyan's atelier is in Topane. In that same location, they hanged Armenians. And then this is a postcard, a souvenir postcard of the Suleymaniye Mosque from 1915, which was designed by Mimar Sinan, who is believed to be an ethnic Armenian in 1558. And on August 1st, 1935, amid whispers that the most famous architect in Turkish history might have been Armenian, his skull was removed from his tomb in order to measure it in an attempt to prove that the famed architect was an ethnic Turk. The skull went missing soon after and remains at large. And so this is images from the inside of the atelier when I was working with Kemal Cimbiz. You can see here the way that they put together these friezes that you see on ceilings, and there's a piece downstairs that makes reference to that kind of fragmentation. This is the last photo that I took in his atelier. He promptly kicked me out. It turned out that he was uncomfortable, I think, with the politics of the project and insisted that there was never an Armenian genocide, and said that they did what they had to do. There was a war. The Armenians were aligned with the Russians during World War I, and all they did was move them away. And so it became a completely irreconcilable situation, and so I ended up with a project that was on life support. The resolution to all this was that I met an apprentice of Kemal Cimbiz, who was an apprentice of Garabet Cezayirliyan, so it continues the line further down. This is Nerdoğan Çakmak. He's surviving by making some of those styrofoam ones that you see up there on the outside of his store. But Nerdoğan has Garabet's molds from the MX Cinema and also the Yıldız Palace in Istanbul. And he was very happy to work with me. One of the reasons that a lot of these molds have survived over the years is that they were made in this very classical way of mixing gum arabic with bones of animals to make this crude version of silicone. This is a picture of the MX Cinema. It opened its doors in 1924. Its demolition in 2013 to make way for a shopping mall served as the start of the Gezi Park protests. And so I couldn't think about this image without thinking about this image and how it relates to all the local heroes like Richard Nicol and John Vinci and Tim Samuelson and Eric Nordstrom and the other people who are working very hard to kind of pick up the ruins of Chicago's bodies and piece them back together in some way or find a place for them to rest. So the MX Cinema and the Garrick Theater share this history of inspiring these moments where people started to wonder what it is that we're doing with spaces. Armenian craftspeople designed the decorative motifs in the Yildiz Palace. This is Garabet's studio that I'm basically referring to. It's an Ottoman complex that was built by the Italian architect Raimondo da Ronco for Sultan Abdulhamid II in 1880. The Yildiz Palace, which means Star Palace, became the fourth seat of the Ottoman government when, fearing a seaside attack, the Sultan vacated the Dolmabahce Palace, built by the Armenian architect Garabet Cezayirliyan, which also had Art Nouveau flourishes designed by fellow Armenian Garabet Cezayirliyan. So it started to be very much, and these are the casts from the MX Cinema. This was very much a project that now was really investigating the intersection of gentrification and genocide, and to understand that dispossession and displacement are very much a kind of common thread through these two stories. And so one of the things that you'll see in both locations is a vitrine that attempts to marry a fragment of the Garrick Theater and a fragment of the MX Cinema, and to kind of design something in between that bridges Chicago and Istanbul. And you know, the crazier things that comes up in the research, it turns out that the Garrick Theater in the 1930s was briefly called the Balaban Theater. A Balaban is an Armenian word. It's an alternative word for the musical instrument duduk. So there's these links that I enjoy building. This is the table that you'll see downstairs. This is an excavated skeleton of one of the 80,000 dogs that were exiled to the barren island of Sivriada in 1910. This is one that was reconditioned in 2010 that was given to a French industrialist who made bone glue and leather from the dogs that the authorities rounded up that didn't end up on the island. These are livestock bones from Vakifli, the last remaining Armenian village in Turkey, populated by the descendants of the Armenians who resisted and survived the massacres of 1915 on Musa Dag. And so I wanted to step back, as the text says downstairs, from this anthropocentric concept of citizen and to urge a broader consideration of the forces that shape our narratives as well as our environments. And so what I did with this was to think about the way that the mold leads to the cast. And the mold has influence over the cast, the master has influence over the apprentice, and then to see bone in both of those things. And so we ground up the bones of the dogs from Sivriada and the livestock bones from Vakifli and put it into the plaster mixture of all the casts that you see downstairs in that main room. And so when I was thrown out of Kemal's studio, I panicked. And in my bedroom where I was staying in Istanbul, I put together the bones to start to mimic some of the things that I was able to remember from the atelier. I sent this image to Carolyn. She was very encouraging. And so you see some of these designs down there. These are dog bones from Sivriada and bullet casts from a mold made by the Ottoman gunpowder factory, imitating the frieze that's found on the Krikor Lusavoric Armenian church in Galata. And so this is the church that I was looking at every day outside of the Greek school, and you can see the grapevine motif, which is common in Armenian architecture. It's a symbol of life. Then I went back to the Rhona building and decided to try to replicate that with bones. And then these are bones dreaming of becoming shells, dreaming of becoming Art Nouveau, dreaming of becoming Istanbul. While all this was taking place, I also worked with a team of students, Armenian students from the Armenian high schools throughout Istanbul, to find the buildings that were all made by the minorities like the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Kurds, and to do frottage of these so that they would hang like so many skins in the Galata Greek school. This is the Botter, Casa Botter, which was built by Raimondo Daronco. And what I found was, also on eBay, was this kafia that belonged to a dragoman. And the dragoman were the interpreters for the Ottoman Empire. So they spoke Persian, they spoke Armenian, they spoke Kurdish. And so they were the ones who translated between all the different groups and sort of kept everything under one umbrella. And it turned out that the architects were explained to me as being like dragoman. So architects from Europe, like Raimondo Daronco, who designed Casa Botter and other notable Istanbul buildings, including the Yildiz Palace, had to be proficient in Armenian and Greek to communicate with the artisans who ornamented their buildings. Their motifs, too, brought together a multiplicity of architectural languages, among them Baroque, Islamic, and Art Nouveau. And Dr. Emiliano Bugatti, an architectural historian, explained to me that this new amalgamation of all these different styles, this kind of bricolage, is often referred to as Levantine. So I started to see the city in a very different way. This is one of the Armenian high school students, Jennifer Dadian, and she explained to me that her family, the Dadian family, actually headed the Ottoman gunpowder factory. And so her great-grandfather was responsible for making these Ottoman bullet molds, which featured prominently in the exhibition. This is the way they were displayed. And I don't want to give away too much because I want you guys to see the exhibition and not feel like I've told you all about it. So this is the way that the piece, like I said, had appeared before. And then, of course, not of course, but unfortunately the project was vandalized. People went through smudging out the name Armenian, and also they stole the bullet mold, so I had to replace that. And one of the things that I really wanted was for there to be a kind of overlap between inside and outside. And we don't have the Srp Kirkor Lusavorich church outside our window, but the spectral presence of it is drawn downstairs. The one other thing that I want to conclude with is that laid end to end, Garabet Cezayirliyan is said to have created 5 kilometers of architectural ornamentation across the city of Istanbul. So if you think about this one Armenian craftsman being responsible for that amount of space, think about what would have happened to that city had all the motifs disappeared along with the people. And a parallel extension of this work, The Flesh is Yours, the Bones Are Ours, continues 5 kilometers away at Rhona Hoffman Gallery, with an archive of frottage from hundreds of buildings throughout Istanbul, as well as a collection of artifacts that I've told you about. So I wanted to kind of include that space in between the exhibitions, not just because these two wonderful, I don't want to call Rhona's gallery an institution, but Rhona, you're an institution. So these two institutions that so generously supported the work have half the piece, but I want you to feel that space that one person created, and to think about accumulation as opposed to silence and emptiness. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. Somebody's not sure, but I think, yeah, they might.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I just had a question about what the response from the Armenian community in Istanbul was. You mentioned that there were students that were helping you out. Just in this current climate, I mean, just a few weeks ago, Armenian member of parliament in Turkey was subject to slurs about his ethnic identity. And with the murder of Hrant Dink just a few years ago, being openly Armenian in Turkey is dangerous and it's not necessarily a safe thing to be. So I found that I've spent time in Istanbul and I found that people are reluctant to express pride in being Armenian and to be openly Armenian and embrace that identity. So yeah, I was just wondering what the community response generally was like.
Well, thank you. I can't speak for a community. This is a question about reception, and I'm not necessarily privy to everything afterwards. And Agos, the newspaper that Hrant Dink, the journalist who was assassinated 9 years ago, wrote for, did a feature on it. And the people that I met from the generation of the Garabet and afterwards were appreciative of the work communicating some of this, but I don't have a much more robust answer for you. You'd have to ask them. But the high school students were really into it. At certain points, it was like we would take the ladders out under the cover of night to do the frottage, because they considered it like a weird reverse graffiti, I guess. They didn't like that we were doing this, and they would I'd be like, well, wait, we don't know for sure if that's Armenian. They'd be like, it's Armenian, They're like, it's probably Armenian, and they got really into it, and it was nice to see that, because I think there is a pride. But they also feel like they're part of, I have to be honest, they feel like they're part of Istanbul. They feel like they're part of Turkey. And that's the thing about all this, is that, it's not a project that's meant to like simply point blame. It's just, like these buildings, you can see them as being almost like the structure of what it meant to be Ottoman, and all these decorative motifs that attach to them identify all the different sort of pluralities, that are part of that society. So there's a desire to be part of it. There's 30,000 Armenians in Istanbul. And what happened in Anatolia was a lot worse than what happened in Istanbul. But they consider themselves part of Istanbul, but they also feel like they'll never really belong. So there's a bias, there's a racism, there's ethnic tension, so it includes, but it also, like, it separates. They go to Armenian high schools, that are known for being Armenian. There is that one Armenian church that I showed. There's others. So it can be a risk, but I can't spectacularize that risk. I think that somebody else needs to talk about that. I didn't witness much other than the things that I showed you in terms of like being kicked out of the atelier, and then also like some of the erasure of the work. So I'm sorry I can't give you more of an answer to that.
Thank you, Michael. I'm really interested between this like juxtaposition of gentrification and genocide, and just made me think of like just reevaluating genocide and how it's embedded into gentrification and urban planning, and how sometimes buildings are the only thing that survive this. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate more in that, and the like sort of the balance that you do in your work between like history, metaphors, and poetics with the materials that you work with, and how that perhaps relates to this erasure of history.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm very conveniently now forgetting the first part of your question, which gentrification, genocide. Yeah, there's quite a lot that one can see, like I said, like the history of libercide and biblioclasm and state-sponsored destruction of artifacts, antiquities, and culture happens alongside those same weapons being turned on the people. You know, so buildings and objects can sometimes speak those traumas as well. I used to be really upset, you know, about the fact that, like, when I did the project about the Iraq Museum for the first time, it was done largely because we could go through Chelsea. We were living in a war culture. A pathos that opened up in the war. When the looting of the museum happened, it wasn't just an Iraqi. Never translated and does, you know, and you know, historians have, because like in the midst of the Iraq Museum project, I'll talk about the narrative of Donnie George, who was the director of the museum, but then I focus in on the fact that, like, in order to get out of Ba'ath Party meetings, he excavations, and they're like, well, that's not important, and I'm like, but then he also was a drummer in a band called Deep Purple, which was responsible for being like, you know, no, it was a band called 99%, which was the best Deep Purple and Pink Floyd cover band, you know? And that to me was hugely important. Historians, like, they're not, you know, so I don't want to be orthodox about it, you know, and I do want to be able to, I'm interested in dealing with facts because truths here are important, especially with this. But I also think that there is poetry to be found there. Does that? Yeah. Back
there. This is maybe a slightly similar question, but so I was just thinking about the early inflatable structures and the enemy kitchen and and so on, and of course those were very direct in some way, very much about praxis, we might say, as opposed to say poesis, that these later works seem to invoke more. And the later works, in a way, they seem to turn away, you know, away from the present to the past, to an idea of memory. They seem to be bound up with historical preservation or something. Of course, the past is always present in the present, but still there is a kind of turn, you know, that they represent. And so the question, and this, you know, it may not work at all, but I'll give it a shot. And I was just also thinking about the Armenians, but then also the Kurds in Turkey, and how both are, you know, two, you know, very much minority groups and groups that feel very persecuted. And the Kurds have, you know, a long history with the PKK and Rojava and all these sort of initiatives of being very praxis-oriented, we might say. And the Armenians may as well, but I'm not as aware of that. I'm, you know, much more attuned to what the Kurds are doing. So I guess the question is, you know, it's almost as stupid as being, you know, why the Armenians and not the Kurds, you know, and how does that relate to this shift in your practice towards a more memory-based, historical preservation, object-based thing, and away from building structures and providing food and so on?
Well, thank you for that very complicated question.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. One thing to say is that these are ongoing works. So I do parasite to some degree every winter, whether it's like building a shelter or it's distributing, you know, the skill set. So I'm committed to that project still. Enemy Kitchen, of course, also continues. I like to have different things going on in the work, but I also am very, very clear about my subscription to poetics. One of the interesting arguments I had with Wadichko when I was studying with him at MIT was, you know, he was insistent that the shelters should inflate with like a solar panel. And I was like, but that gets rid of the whole fucking connection to the building, you know, like that's the architectural CPR. You know, that's one building breathing into the other. It's about the ecology of the city, you know. So I'm very aware every time I'm working, I'm very aware of poetics, and I personally, that's where I get excited about being an artist. But I also, and with Enemy Kitchen, the hands that are making like the kebabs and everything, it's like a refugee fist and then a veteran fist, and there's this weird communion of ingesting these things. So those things are present. I also have a knife that I had designed by Saddam Hussein's personal sword maker, that's part of the truck and making these meals. So I'm interested in mobilizing those things, and it is in a more outward-facing and direct way, but I still see these projects in Bamiyan and also the one in Turkey as having these outwardly facing moments, whether it's like, the Armenian students engaging in this kind of architectural seance, of taking the façades off the buildings and the impression of it, and having what's happening now meet the future and know that those are still unresolved wounds. And the other thing to say about the Kurds, like I made it clear in my talk, I'm also talking about the Kurds, I'm also talking about the Greeks, I'm talking about all the minorities. The population exchanges, these terms that come up, population exchanges of like the Greeks being dispossessed, from Turkey after the establishment of the nation state. Like, these are violent dispossessions of people, and they happen everywhere. They happen in Israel, Palestine. It's happening now with the Kurds, but I also want to address the amnesia, because you can't say these things in Istanbul without risking something. I risked people erasing things on the pencil or whatever, and I got to leave, but I got to say something and not have the repercussions visited on me as they've been visited on other people. Having, Ataturk Airport for an Armenian is like a Jew having like Hitler Airport in Berlin, So these wounds are still very much alive, So I actually would argue that I'm not just stepping back into history, because these are historical wounds that are very much alive. And when you see what Turkey is doing with the Kurds, they're doing it because they have never been able to deal with what they did to the Armenians or anybody else. So those wounds are still alive, and they're creating new ones.
Thanks for showing the work in the context of your earlier work. I think one of the things that's always impressive is the ability of your work to take an artifact and basically open up an incredible number of narrative connections, either between different artifacts or just out of one. And I'm wondering, maybe in that case, the artifact itself, like especially the objects from the Baghdad Museum, I don't know if they're not necessarily so precious as material objects. I'm wondering how things.
It's a great question. I think that there's my assistants using this project. I'm not an Arabic reader, but the artifacts from 2000. Slivers of newspaper made since 2013. It's all about Syria, but I don't read that layer of the work, and so that ends up being something that's brought to me by others, so there's an accumulation of information that I don't necessarily know. The stone was important to me because it was a return to stone carving. It was part of this narrative. It's idiosyncratic. I'm talking about my own history in some ways, but I'm also talking about the Buddhas of Bamiyan, which were made out of stone and mud and everything. And it seemed to me that in talking about the books that were burned in Kassel, it was interesting to have one cultural atrocity suture and heal another, but by basically making a tombstone for the book that can't be opened anymore. I think my goal is to always to create the apparition. I'm never remaking the thing. It's impossible to remake the thing. This is one of my problems with all this 3D printing of artifacts and whatever else, is that it doesn't maintain a certain criticality to the fact that history can't be remade. So for me, it's about the reconstruction of an aura, but it's not the thing. And the materials are always up for grabs. It's whatever the context calls for. So
I think we should take this downstairs.
let's take it downstairs. Thank you all.
Thank you for everything.
Thank you.
It was such a beautiful introduction.